In the winter of 1884, a quiet farming town in the American frontier stopped sleeping. It began with a rumor, a body found in the woods, partially buried beneath frozen soil. No official report was filed, no newspaper mentioned it. Yet, by the following week, whispers had turned into certainty. Someone in town had done something unspeakable. Livestock had gone missing before. Travelers occasionally disappeared along the old trade road. That was frontier life, hard, unforgiving. But this was different. This time the fear was not of wolves, it was of neighbors. Within days, doors were barred before sunset. Church attendance doubled. Men who had shared drinks the previous month now avoided eye contact. Mothers pulled children indoors at the sound of footsteps. The sheriff claimed there was no evidence of wrongdoing, but evidence in times of panic becomes secondary. By March, accusations spread like wildfire. One family was named, then another. A farm was searched. Bones were found. Human, animal. The records would later contradict themselves. What followed was not just an investigation. It was a collapse of trust. Was there truly a hidden crime buried beneath the snow of 1884? Or did fear consume the town faster than any hunger ever could? Because history shows us something unsettling. Sometimes the most dangerous thing in an isolated community is not violence, it is suspicion. And in 1884, suspicion was starving. Before we move further into what happened in the winter of 1884, we need to understand the kind of place this town was. It was not large enough to appear on most national maps, fewer than 800 residents, a cluster of wooden houses, a church with a leaning steeple, a general store that doubled as the post office, and farmland stretching outward into cold, open distance. Winters were long, supplies were limited. News from the outside world often arrived weeks late. Life on the frontier demanded resilience, but it also bred isolation. In towns like this, reputation was currency. Families were known by their surnames. Generations shared land. Disputes were rarely written down, but never forgotten. The sheriff was elected not because he was feared, but because he was trusted. And trust was everything. By early January of 1884, small irregularities began surfacing. Livestock unaccounted for, a drifter who never reached the next settlement, a farmer claiming he had seen lights moving near the forest line long after midnight. None of these incidents alone were extraordinary. Together, however, they formed a pattern. The problem with patterns is that once people begin looking for them, they start finding them everywhere. And in a place where winter already strained nerves and resources, fear did not need proof to grow. Before we examine the first official complaint filed that year, let me ask you something. Where are you listening from tonight? Are you hearing this story from a quiet rural town or from a city that never truly sleeps? Leave your location in the comments. I read everyone. And if you're drawn to historical mysteries told with care, context, and depth, consider subscribing to the channel. It helps this project grow and ensures you don't miss the next investigation waiting in the shadows. Now let's look at the first accusation that changed everything. By mid-January of 1884, the town had changed in ways that were difficult to measure but impossible to ignore. Nothing dramatic had occurred in public. There were no official emergency meetings, no proclamations nailed to wooden posts, no arrests. Yet the atmosphere had shifted. Conversations grew shorter. Smiles became cautious. Even routine exchanges at the general store carried an unfamiliar tension. It was not that people believed something had happened. It was that they felt something had. And in small frontier communities, feeling often precedes fact. Winter had sealed the roads in ice. The nearest neighboring settlement was 2 days away by wagon, longer in heavy snow. That isolation magnified uncertainty. Every unanswered question lingered longer than it should. Every unexplained absence felt heavier. A traveling laborer who had passed through town in December had not been seen since. Ordinarily, this would not have raised alarm. Frontier routes were unpredictable. Men drifted between towns seeking work. Some never returned. But this time, the timing felt wrong. The livestock discrepancies began being discussed more openly. A farmer quietly mentioned that he had found fencing disturbed near the tree line. Another claimed that dogs had been restless at night, barking toward the forest without clear cause. None of these details proved anything, but together they began forming a narrative. one shaped not by evidence but by repetition. Church sermons subtly shifted tone. Messages once focused on perseverance and faith began emphasizing moral vigilance. The language was careful, but the implication was clear. Danger does not always come from outside. It was during one such Sunday gathering that the first name was spoken aloud in suspicion, not by the sheriff, not by any official authority, but by a neighbor. And that is when the panic truly began to take form, because once suspicion attaches to a face, it becomes far more difficult to contain. No one wanted to believe that something hidden was unfolding within their own community, but no one wanted to dismiss the possibility either. Trust, once fractured, does not shatter loudly. It erodes quietly. And by late January, the town was no longer asking if something was wrong. They were asking who was responsible. The first name spoken in suspicion was Elias Mercer. Until that winter, Elias had lived on the outskirts of town in relative obscurity. He owned a modest stretch of land near the tree line where forest began swallowing cultivated fields. He was neither wealthy nor destitute, widowed 3 years prior, no children, few close ties beyond occasional trade at the general store. He was known, but not well known, and in communities built on familiarity, that difference matters. Elias kept irregular hours. Neighbors had noticed lantern light in his barn long after midnight on more than one occasion. He rarely attended church, offering no explanation. During harsh winters, he was said to rely more on trapping and hunting than on stored provisions. None of these behaviors were crimes. But in January of 1884, they were enough. The rumor began quietly that Mercer had been seen near the forest on the same night the traveling laborer vanished, that his dogs had been heard howling unusually late. That smoke from his chimney carried a scent unfamiliar to those who passed nearby. It is important to note none of these claims were documented at the time. They spread through repetition, not record. The first formal mention of Elias Mercer appears in the sheriff's ledger dated January 19th, 1884. The entry is brief. Community concern expressed regarding activities of EM. No actionable evidence. That line would later be referenced repeatedly, because in times of fear, even the absence of evidence can feel incriminating. What truly escalated suspicion, however, was not Mercer's isolation. It was the discovery made 3 days later on the edge of his property, not proof of violence, not confirmation of wrongdoing, but something ambiguous enough to sustain doubt. And ambiguity, in a frightened town, is combustible. Sheriff Thomas Hale had served the town for nearly 8 years. He was not an aggressive lawman, nor particularly ambitious. His authority rested on moderation. He understood that maintaining order in a small settlement often required restraint rather than force. When the first group of townspeople approached him formally on January 22nd, they did not demand an arrest. They demanded reassurance. Hale visited Mercer's property the following morning. The record states he found the premises orderly, livestock accounted for, no visible disturbances beyond ordinary winter wear. Mercer himself reportedly cooperated, answering questions without visible agitation. According to Hale's later recollection, Elias expressed frustration, not fear. He insisted the rumors were baseless, that he had done nothing beyond tending his land and trapping game, as many did during winter scarcity. The sheriff noted no evidence linking Mercer to any disappearance, but that visit did not calm the town. It did the opposite. Because once an authority investigates and finds nothing, those already convinced of wrongdoing often interpret it differently, not as absence of crime, but as failure to uncover it. Within days, informal searches began, not led by law enforcement, but by citizens. Fence lines were inspected, wood piles examined, tracks in snow interpreted with growing certainty. The investigation was no longer about facts. It had become about validation. And Sheriff Hale found himself walking a narrow line: protect a man against unproven accusation, or protect a community against escalating fear. The winter of 1884 was no longer just about survival. It had become a test of trust, and how quickly it could fracture under pressure. The discovery was not dramatic. There were no screams, no dramatic confrontation, no sudden revelation that froze the town in place. It was at first glance almost ordinary. On the morning of January 26th, Two farmers walking the perimeter between their fields and Mercer's wooded boundary noticed something partially exposed beneath the snow near the tree line. The recent thaw had softened the ground just enough to reveal disturbed soil. They approached cautiously. What they found was not immediately identifiable. Fragments of bone, scattered, incomplete, weathered. There was no clear indication of origin, no intact structure, no clothing, no tools nearby. Just fragments partially embedded in frozen earth. One of the farmers later claimed he recognized the shape as human. The other disagreed. He insisted they could have belonged to livestock discarded during winter slaughter. The disagreement itself became fuel. Within hours, word spread through town. By late afternoon, more residents had gathered at the edge of Mercer's property than the sheriff could comfortably manage. Sheriff Hale arrived quickly, urging restraint, reminding those present that no conclusions could be drawn without proper examination. He collected the fragments personally and secured them for inspection. There was no local medical examiner. The nearest trained physician was 2 days away by wagon. Snow threatened to close the road again, so the bones remained in Hale's custody overnight. That delay was enough. By morning, the story had evolved. The fragments were no longer uncertain. In conversation, they had already become confirmation. Confirmation of the laborer's disappearance. Confirmation of hidden wrongdoing. Confirmation that the town's fear had been justified all along. Yet when examined days later by the physician from the neighboring settlement, the report was far less decisive. The fragments were described as inconclusive, possibly animal, possibly human, too incomplete to determine with certainty. But by then, certainty was no longer what the town sought. The damage had already been done. Because ambiguity does not calm fear, it sharpens it. And now, for the first time, Elias Mercer was not merely suspected. He was divided against his own community. It happened quietly, which, in a town already strained by suspicion, made it far worse. On February 3rd, 1884, Samuel Whitaker failed to return home. Whitaker was not a drifter, not a passing laborer whose absence could be dismissed as frontier unpredictability. He was born in the settlement, married, 2 children, known at church, known at the general store, known by nearly everyone. He had left just after sunrise, intending to inspect fencing near the eastern pasture. It was a routine task. He carried tools. He expected to return before dusk. He did not. By nightfall, neighbors organized a search. Lanterns moved across frozen fields in scattered lines. His name was called into the dark over and over, swallowed by the trees. They found no struggle, no abandoned equipment, no obvious sign of misfortune. Only tracks leading toward the forest. And once again, the forest meant proximity to Elias Mercer's land. It is important to emphasize there was no direct evidence linking Mercer to Whitaker's disappearance, but the pattern, whether real or imagined, had solidified. 2 missing men. Bone fragments near Mercer's property, rumors already in circulation. By the following morning, the tone of the town had changed from fear to urgency. The sermons that Sunday were no longer subtle. The message was unmistakable. Evil hides in plain sight. What had begun as concern had now evolved into conviction, and conviction does not wait for proof. Sheriff Hale found himself surrounded on February 5th, not physically attacked, not threatened outright, but pressed. A delegation of town elders, landowners, and church leaders requested immediate action. They argued that waiting for definitive evidence endangered everyone, that Whitaker's disappearance demanded decisive authority. Hale responded with the same statement he had repeated for weeks. There is no charge to file. But that answer no longer satisfied anyone. Whispers turned into organized meetings. Some citizens proposed forming a protective committee, a polite term often used in frontier communities when formal law enforcement was considered too slow. Mercer, aware of the rising hostility, reportedly remained on his property. He avoided town entirely. That absence only deepened suspicion. By February 8th, pressure reached its peak. A written petition was drafted demanding Mercer's detention pending full inquiry. It did not accuse him of a specific crime. It accused him of being the only plausible explanation. Sheriff Hale faced a dilemma familiar to many isolated lawmen of the era. Arrest a man without charge to appease fear, or uphold the law and risk losing control of the town, because by now something else had become clear. This was no longer just about Elias Mercer. It was about whether fear would overrule order. And history has shown, time and again, that when communities feel cornered, restraint becomes fragile. It was not discovered in the forest, not in Mercer's barn, not buried beneath snow. It appeared in the sheriff's office. On the evening of February 10th, as Sheriff Hale reviewed the original ledger entries regarding the traveling laborer from December, he noticed something small, almost trivial at first glance. The laborer had signed his name upon arrival at the general store when purchasing supplies, but the signature was not complete. There was a hesitation in the ink stroke, a smudge, as if the pen had paused mid-letter. Hale compared it to other signatures in the registry. The handwriting was inconsistent, not dramatically different, but altered enough to suggest something unsettling. The laborer might not have written it himself. The sheriff then revisited another detail long ignored. The drifter had reportedly mentioned traveling east toward the rail line, not deeper into frontier territory. Yet the last reported sighting placed him near the western forest, the direction opposite his stated route. Why would a man move away from his intended path? More importantly, who had confirmed that sighting? When Hale retraced the source of the claim, he found something troubling. The original statement placing the laborer near Mercer's land had not come from a neutral witness. It came from one of the farmers who later discovered the bone fragments, the same farmer who had been most vocal in pressing accusations. Individually, none of these inconsistencies proved deception, but together they disrupted the pattern everyone had accepted as fact. Hale began asking quiet questions. He learned that Samuel Whitaker, the second missing man, had recently entered a land dispute with that same farmer over boundary lines, a dispute that, until recently, had remained private. Suddenly the narrative shifted. If Whitaker's disappearance predated the most intense rumors, and if the bone fragments were inconclusive, and if the key witness had personal motives, then perhaps the panic had not formed organically. Perhaps it had been guided, not by evidence, but by opportunity. And if that were true, then the town's fear had been directed toward the wrong man all along. For the first time since January, suspicion fractured in a new direction, not outward, toward the isolated woodsman, but inward, toward someone who had stood comfortably at the center of community trust. And that realization was far more destabilizing than any rumor of hidden crime. Because now the question was no longer, did something terrible happen? It was, who benefited from the fear? Sheriff Hale did not announce his suspicions. He did not gather townspeople. He did not issue a statement. He did not make an arrest. Instead, on the morning of February 12th, he walked alone to the property of Nathaniel Crow. Crow was one of the town's more established farmers. His land bordered Whitaker's. He had been among the first to demand Mercer's detention. He had also been present at the discovery of the bone fragments. And until now, no one had questioned him. Hale arrived without accusation. He spoke calmly, asked simple questions. Where were you on the night Whitaker disappeared? When did you first suspect Mercer? Why did you believe the bones were human? Crow's answers were measured, controlled, reasonable, too reasonable. He claimed he had only acted in the town's interest, that his suspicions were based on observation, not emotion, that he feared what inaction might lead to. Hale listened carefully. Then he mentioned the land dispute. Crow's posture shifted, subtly but noticeably. The dispute had involved a strip of pasture land no wider than a wagon road, small in scale, but significant enough in value to matter during a harsh winter. Whitaker had insisted on a survey. Crow had resisted. No threats had been recorded, no public argument, but tensions had existed. Hale then introduced the final detail, the inconsistent signature. Crow did not react strongly, but he did not seem surprised. And that, to the sheriff, was more telling than denial. The conversation ended without escalation. No charges filed, no formal declaration made. Yet when Hale left the property, he understood something critical. The panic that had engulfed the town might not have been spontaneous. It might have been strategically encouraged, because fear, when directed properly, becomes a shield, and if Mercer remained the center of suspicion, no one would look elsewhere. The sheriff now faced a new dilemma. If he shifted suspicion publicly toward Crow without solid proof, the town could fracture further. If he remained silent, an innocent man might still be detained to satisfy public fear. For the first time since January, the case was no longer about disappearance alone. It was about manipulation, and manipulation is far harder to prove than rumor. Sheriff Hale did not announce his suspicions. He did not gather townspeople. He did not issue a statement. He did not make an arrest. Instead, on the morning of February 12th, he walked alone to the property of Nathaniel Crow. Crow was one of the town's more established farmers. His land bordered Whitaker's. He had been among the first to demand Mercer's detention. He had also been present at the discovery of the bone fragments, and until now no one had questioned him. Hale arrived without accusation. He spoke calmly, asked simple questions. Where were you on the night Whitaker disappeared? When did you first suspect Mercer? Why did you believe the bones were human? Crow's answers were measured, controlled, reasonable, too reasonable. He claimed he had only acted in the town's interest, that his suspicions were based on observation, not emotion, that he feared what inaction might lead to. Hale listened carefully. Then he mentioned the land dispute. Crow's posture shifted. Subtly but noticeably, the dispute had involved a strip of pasture land no wider than a wagon road, small in scale, but significant enough in value to matter during a harsh winter. Whitaker had insisted on a survey. Crow had resisted. No threats had been recorded. No public argument, but tensions had existed. Hale then introduced the final detail, the inconsistent signature. Crow did not react strongly, but he did not seem surprised, and that to the sheriff was more telling than denial. The conversation ended without escalation, no charges filed, no formal declaration made. Yet when Hale left the property, he understood something critical. The panic that had engulfed the town might not have been spontaneous. It might have been strategically encouraged, because fear, when directed properly, becomes a shield. And if Mercer remained the center of suspicion, no one would look elsewhere. The sheriff now faced a new dilemma. If he shifted suspicion publicly toward Crow without solid proof, the town could fracture further. If he remained silent, an innocent man might still be detained to satisfy public fear. For the first time since January, the case was no longer about disappearance alone. It was about manipulation, and manipulation is far harder to prove than rumor. The winter of 1884 did not become famous for a crime. It became remembered for a rumor, for a season when fear moved faster than evidence, when suspicion felt safer than uncertainty, when a town nearly sacrificed one of its own, not because of proof, but because of pressure. The Cannibal Panic of 1884 was never about hunger. It was about narrative, about how quickly a story once believed reshapes reality. And perhaps that is the quiet lesson history leaves behind. Not every shadow hides a monster, but every isolated community must decide what it will do when darkness feels close. Before we close this investigation, I'd like to ask you something. Where are you listening from tonight? Are you in a small town where everyone knows each other, or in a city where anonymity feels safer? Leave your location in the comments. I read every one. And if you appreciate historical mysteries explored with context, restraint, and depth, consider subscribing to Macabre Secrets. There are many more forgotten cases waiting in the margins of history, some rooted in fact, some born from fear, but all revealing something about the fragile nature of trust. I'll see you in the next investigation.